Often in history you find potential nations that failed to rise or which didn't exist for very long. Some due to being unlucky, others due to poor geography, or even simply not being functional or sustainable by their very nature. These prospective nations, however, are not just found in our past, but also in our hypothetical future. That is, nations that some individuals, whether they be inhabitants of these lands or external observers, think will come to be. But these potential nations have so much working against them that it is unlikely that they will exist, or if they do, they either won't exist for very long, or not in their expected form. Today we are looking at 5 nations that probably won't succeed, starting from the most likely to pull through to nations that are downright impossible. Before we go any further, let's take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play online PvP strategy game that lets you take control of a country, build an army using several land, naval, and air units, and fight up to 128 players in real-time games that test your strategic planning and can last for weeks. Now you can take the game wherever you go since you can play with the same account on PC and mobile. I think you'll really appreciate the over 100 beautifully modeled modern weapon systems, including the nuclear ballistic submarine, combat attack helicopters, stealth strike fighters, airborne infantry units, and many more. If you enjoy Geopolitics, you'll have a blast playing this game. Follow the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and a 1-month premium membership absolutely free, but be sure to act quick because this offer only goes for the next 30 days. Don't miss out. Now, back to the video. Number 5. Independent California. Boasting a population of almost 40 million, which is roughly 12% of the United States population, being roughly the geographic size of the North African country of Morocco, along with having the 8th largest economy in the world when listed as its own country, many think that California could be a viable independent nation. However, when taking into account a lack of support and geographic issues, it would be almost impossible for California to become its own nation, and if it did, it would require immensely skilled leadership to keep it together. To begin with, for California to even become a nation, it would need to secede from the Union, which is a process that would meet significant resistance from those within the state. This is because many moderates, for obvious reasons, are not in favor of secession, with recent polls indicating on average only 36% of Americans nationally across party lines supporting secession, mostly coming from Republicans and Independents who both score roughly 40% on average nationally. The West Coast collectively, however, demonstrated support for secessionism from nearly 50% of Democrats polled, far more than any other Democrat population in the country, the National Democrat average being about 28%. In 2017, many Democrats within California were calling for secession following Trump's election, though it's estimated only 31% of Californians at the time supported Cal Exit, the movement for an independent California. Gaining support from moderates to give legitimate popular appeal to a legal movement for secession would be a hurdle, but not impossible. The real political roadblock would be gaining support from the left, who are acutely aware of California's electoral importance to any Democratic victory in the presidential elections and holding power in the House. Given its unmatched 55 electoral votes and 52 representatives, politically savvy Democrats would question why secession should be considered when such an advantage is already held at the national level. It is unlikely left-wing politicians would support this at the national level, as it would effectively turn America into a nation with a conservative majority to even a potential supermajority depending on where votes are redistributed to. Even then, if a California secession movement were to gain a large enough majority and strong political support, it would still face significant problems, with the state being home to 32 military bases that were largely built during World War II, along with many of its urban centers being along the coast, putting them at risk of attack should the United States attempt to forcibly prevent them from seceding. Given that the most likely reason for the states to secede would be due to a radical Republican-led federal government, it is almost assured the United States would attempt to prevent them from leaving in order to protect the vast population of roughly 5 million Republicans in the state, not to mention resecure the state's lucrative economy, protect the integrity of the Union, and maintain the continent as secure from rival powers. In addition, this divide also puts the state at significant risk, with the heavily conservative north and smaller urban Republican populations likely to put up resistance, the north of the state potentially seceding in a similar fashion to West Virginia upon the secession of the South. The loss of the north leads to one of the most pressing issues for California, a scarcity of water. California's biggest issue ever since its population boomed has been a lack of water supply, the state having to build massive irrigation projects just to ensure that its heavily populated south has enough water to survive, going so far as to destroy the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. Southern California's Metropolitan Water District had to declare a state of emergency in 2021 over water scarcity, meaning the state would be facing significant water issues regardless. Once again, fixing all of these problems would require incredibly competent leadership that would be able to negotiate with the United States federal government, be willing to enact large-scale infrastructure projects to deal with the water scarcity, and finally be willing to resettle its urban liberal populations in the north and interior, which will either be in rebellion or abandoned. California simply does not have the adequate means to sustain itself unless of course it were to find these resources elsewhere, possibly expanding into the water-rich Pacific Northwestern states of Oregon and Washington, something which opens up a whole new set of problems for the United States, and which would surely create an increased potential for conflict, not only from the US who risks losing its entire western coastline, but also from the states themselves who, although rich in water, would see their resources strained if they were forced to support all of California. Where does an independent California rank on the inevitability meter? I would say unlikely, but not impossible. Number 4. A united Islamic caliphate. We have all heard of the caliphates of the Middle East, vast empires that span from the Atlantic to Afghanistan. And now today many propose that the Middle East ought to reunite, so as to secure it from outside threats and influences such as China, Russia, and America, none of which have the greatest history with the region. There have also been a number of recent attempts at a united Middle East, whether they be prior to the Sykes-Picot Treaty during World War I with a promise of a single Arab state, a short-lived union between Syria and Egypt that sought to unite the Islamic Arab world, and of course those of modern-day Islamic fundamentalists. However, as great as the desire to achieve this outcome may be, many have conflicting visions on what that would entail, such as which nations would be included and even what branch of Islam the region would be united under. While some do believe that due to the Middle East's history of large ethnic empires that it is inevitable to happen again, the influence of the West, along with the breakdown of many of these transnational relations due to tensions existing within the region over politics, makes it seem less certain. Because of the introduction of the nation-state to the region, we have of course seen greater nationalist movements which have tended toward disunity or personal dominance. Even in nations such as the relatively westernized Turkey, there have been nationalist movements to gain greater autonomy or even independence, such as that of the Kurds in the southeast. Furthermore, as we have seen within Syria and Iraq, the ethnic differences between the various groups at play cause a great degree of instability, leading to near-constant conflict. The only thing which has proven to hold such states together is authoritarian leadership, be it a dictator or monarch. Even then, in nations such as Saudi Arabia, we're seeing the start of conflicts between Shia and Sunni populations, as well as among various ethnic groups, which shows how the Middle East may see a devolution of states as opposed to greater unity. This brings up another issue. What are the borders of a united Middle East? Well, obviously this would include the Arabian Peninsula. Beyond this, issues arise, even going into the Fertile Crescent. The first and most difficult of these is Israel, a Jewish state within the region. This poses significant difficulty for the movement of a united Middle East, since Israel immediately cuts off the vital lands of North Africa from it. This would mean that such a union would require the conquest of Israel, which the Six-Day War has shown to be a difficult task even for multiple Islamic countries working together. It is of course in Israel's interest to prevent a union of these states against it, and could be expected to work against any efforts at such a movement. In many of these movements, Iran is also included, which poses issues for Sunni-led efforts due to Iran's Shia majority, while Morocco and others in North Africa don't show significant interest in such a union. The most significant roadblock for a united Middle East would be the religious divide within Islam. While previously many Islamic caliphates had structures incorporating some form of tolerance, much of the Islamic community today is less so due to the encroachment of the West into the Middle East and divides which grew between Sunni and Shia populations over time. This has led to significant violence between sects and can be seen in the Syrian and Yemeni civil wars, as well as with the rise of terrorist groups that largely follow the Wahhabi branch of Islam supported by the House of Saud. Once again unlikely, but not impossible. Number 3. New Africa. Returning to America, there has been a desire among some of America's black population for an independent black state within the South. The concept of New Africa has its roots in the black nationalist movement, most prominently among figures such as Malcolm X and others who wish for separatism from the white and now Hispanic populations of the country. With the rise of BLM along with other greater political divisions within the United States, some within the racial left have put forward the idea of New Africa or an independent black state as a form of reparations and a solution to the increasing racial tension in the country. The states in question which would constitute the territory of New Africa would be Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, a region we'll simply refer to as the Deep South, and through most of which runs a near contiguous stretch of majority black counties known as the Black Belt. These states in question possessing plurality black populations, though not majorities. Despite this concentration of the black population, in none of these states do blacks constitute an absolute majority. Non-Hispanic whites surpass blacks in Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina roughly 2-1, with Mississippi coming the closest at a 56% non-Hispanic white population and a 38% non-Hispanic black population, concentrated largely along the west of the state, which might place it in a far more strategic position to pursue this outcome than other states. Given these proportions, it seems unlikely that the entirety of these states could be incorporated into New Africa, both if efforts were made to legally secede, which would still leave behind a majority white population in New Africa, or if attempts were made to establish the state through force, as the white populations well outnumber the black population. Though it is perfectly feasible that ideological divides among southern whites might lead some to support the black secessionists. Some might suggest that only the counties of the Black Belt itself constitute New Africa, but this would inevitably divide several of the states it passes through in half and create a whole slew of new problems. If secession is taken up by force, the Black Belt would be surrounded on all sides and left defenseless, while legal secession would be far too much of a political ordeal for the several states involved, and likely see opposition from national Democrats, who rely on the black population, which constitutes a major pillar of their support base. It would also appear that a great deal of support for New Africa doesn't necessarily come from the counties of the Black Belt itself, but rather from black populations of urban centers around the country, albeit including those of the South as well. This does, however, indicate great hurdles at gaining wider support for such a movement. Nearly impossible as it is generally presented, but that could change if it took on a different form. Number 2. Reunified India. India, not the nation but the subcontinent, is a vast geographic region that Westerners sometimes mistake as a largely unified entity, and at one point under the British it was in technical terms fully united, containing all of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, before it was split following independence. Given Gandhi's desire for unity, it is a prominent movement mainly within India today to reunify at the very least with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, along with the possibility of Myanmar, Nepal, and Bhutan. But this does not take into account a number of major factors, such as a much greater desire for separation, the disunity within India itself, and Pakistan and India's nuclear arsenals. To begin with, there is a greater desire for independence than unity. While there is a small but vocal minority who support reunification, most of these nations prefer their independence due to the religious conflicts that mark their past and present. Furthermore, Myanmar would be difficult to integrate given that the nation is currently under what amounts to a military dictatorship, which makes it unlikely that it would join with their neighbors who, with the exception of Sri Lanka and Bhutan, are parliamentary republics. Geopolitically, Pakistan is a strong ally of China, who is a rival of India, making reunification with India difficult. Far greater than that are the religious differences between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, which have proven almost insurmountable. The internal divisions within India are yet another major factor preventing a fully united Indian subcontinent. While in India's history, empires have been able to conquer significant portions of and unite the subcontinent into an empire, most of Indian history is that of disunited kingdoms and smaller states not too dissimilar from Europe. Within India already, there are a number of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups that make up the country, which has created separatism within it, mainly in the division between the Tamil South and Hindu North, which could constitute a video all on its own. In regard to these internal divisions, it does not bode well for a united India given the differences between the two largest faiths of the subcontinent, Islam and Hinduism, especially with the recent rise in Hindu nationalism, which the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been promoting given his shared Hindu religion between the ethnically Hindu North and ethnically Tamil South. Perhaps the greatest issue for a united India would be the risk of nuclear war. Already India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, and while not boasting the vast arsenals that Russia and America do, they still have a significant amount that can act as a deterrent to any type of conflict. While Gandhi and a small present minority may desire a united Indian subcontinent, it is unlikely that it will form, and even if one of the powers were to try to unite it, it would only sow further divisions that could lead to its very destruction. The reunification of the Indian subcontinent, nearly impossible. Number 1. Manchuria. Manchuria is a nation that many know had existed but have little knowledge of. Some within the United States support it and other parts of China for that matter being made independent as a means of weakening China. However, Manchuria, unlike other parts of China such as Xinjiang, does not appear to demonstrate a great desire for independence. For a variety of reasons, chief among them being the near extinction of the Manchu people who once lived in this land, calls for independence have been few and minor. Though numbering 10 million in population, the Manchu are dwarfed by the tens of millions more Han Chinese who inhabit their homeland, with much of that Manchu population spread into historically Han areas of China as well. This has led the actual demand for Manchurian independence to be a largely foreign affair, with demands coming from those who believe that its semi-independence in World War II represented a strong recent desire for an independent Manchu state. However, this incarnation of Manchuria was in reality a largely Japanese effort to establish a puppet government. Even during this time, the Manchurian puppet government had desires of retaking China to re-establish the Qing dynasty, which although led by the Manchus had increasingly seen the assimilation of the Manchus into the larger Chinese culture. We must also address the issue of Manchuria's geography, being surrounded on all sides by various potentially threatening countries who hold territorial ambitions on Manchuria or who may seek to puppet the country as a buffer state. This also brings us to a connected issue. Throughout China's existence, it has generally controlled the lower parts of Manchuria, consequently the wealthiest and most populated areas of the region. However, more important than that is that owning Manchuria represents overcoming the century of humiliation in which China was constantly beaten down by Japan and various Western powers, in which Manchuria was effectively stolen from them by Russia only to be taken by Japan shortly then after. For many Chinese, this has made Manchuria key to their identity and a symbol of their freedom from foreign influence. The lengths that Han China would go to maintain Manchuria, the inability for Manchuria to secure itself from hostile aggressors, and the overall lack of will from the highly assimilated Manchu people leaves the potential for a fully independent Manchuria to be virtually non-existent. But what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Once again, let's thank Conflict of Nations for sponsoring today's video. Follow the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and a 1-month premium membership absolutely free. But remember, this offer only goes for the next 30 days, so don't miss out.